Welcome to this next installment in my video lecture series for the Principles of Microeconomics course. And in this one I'm going to go through the different scenarios of where equilibrium, price, and quantity changes in the marketplace and go through those different scenarios to show you which shifts the demand or the supply curve, which direction it shifts. So as you can see here, what we're talking about right now is an increase in income for a normal good. And income is a determinant of demand. So we know that the demand curve is going to shift. The second part you have to determine is which way it's going to shift. And since we're talking about an increase in income for a normal good, we know that the demand curve is going to shift to the right because there's a positive relationship between income and demand for a normal good. So if you were to be asked a question about this, you would need to show that the demand curve shifts to the right. So we could draw in a demand curve here that has shifted to the right. And one of the things that you should make sure that you do on the exam if I ask a question about this is that you appropriately document and show which is the original demand curve and which is the new demand curve. So as you can see here, I've drawn in demand curve 1 and demand curve 0. So the demand curve 0 is the original demand curve and demand curve 1 is the new demand curve. So when you draw those in, we can show that where is the new equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point occurs where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. So if you go to the point where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve, and if you go straight down, that will show you the new equilibrium quantity. And if you go from that equilibrium point over to the price axis, that will give you the new price. So here we have Q1 and we have P1. So you can see from this graph that what has occurred. When the demand curve shifts to the right, then you might want to put in some arrows indicating that the demand curve has shifted to the right, like that. So I can clearly see that you have the demand curve shifting to the right. And you can tell me, or you can show on the graph, for example, that the equilibrium price increased and that the equilibrium quantity also increased. Let me draw that in again. So when we have an increase in income for a normal good, that causes the demand curve to shift to the right. And when the demand curve shifts to the right, the equilibrium quantity will increase from Q0 to Q1, and the price will increase from P0 to P1. Let me give you another example. Let me pull up that slide. Let's say we have a decrease in income for a normal good. Let me just resize the actual frame there. So again, income is a determinant of demand. So we know the demand curve is going to shift. The question is, which direction is the demand curve going to shift? So when there's an increase in a decrease in income for a normal good, we know that income and demand are positively related to one another. They're moving in the same direction. So if there's a decrease in income for a normal good, the demand curve is going to shift inward. So if I draw in a new demand curve and I label that D1, and I make this D0 to make sure that you are showing that, or I am showing, that there's the original demand curve. D0 is the original demand curve, and here is our new demand curve, D1. Again, you can draw in arrows if you like to show that the demand curve has shifted inward. So we have an arrow there and an arrow here, showing that the demand curve has shifted inward. If we want to see what the new equilibrium price and quantity is, we go to where the new demand curve D1 intersects the original supply curve. So if we go from that intersection point and straight down, that gives us the new equilibrium quantity. So I will label that Q1. And if I want to know what the new equilibrium price is, I go from the point where the demand curve D1 and the supply curve S intersect one another. And if I go across to the price axis, that will give me the new price. So make sure you label all these things. And again, if you like, you can put in arrows to show how the price shifted. So we see the price moving downward. And then we see the quantity moving downward. So when the demand curve shifts inward because of the decrease in income, and this is a normal good, the demand curve shifts to the left. We have a new equilibrium, and this causes the equilibrium price to fall from P0 to P1, and the equilibrium quantity to fall from Q0 to Q1. Let's go over another example. And again, let me resize this so it fits the screen a little better and is easier for everyone to see. And let me change this to a solid line. Now we're talking about an inferior good. So once again, we're talking about income, and we know that income is a determinant of demand. So we know that the demand curve is moving. It's going to shift either to the right or to the left. We have an increase in income for an inferior good. And for an inferior good, the relationship between income and demand is an inverse relationship. They move in opposite directions. So if we have an increase in income, the demand curve is going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left. So if I draw in that new demand curve that represents the increase in income for an inferior good. That is our new demand curve. And let's make sure we label it D1 so we know that we know the difference between the original demand curve and the new demand curve. So make sure again that you label these appropriately. And once again, you could draw in, and let me change that to a dotted line. You could change that and draw in so you're being explicit as to which direction the demand curve is actually shifted. So we see that the demand curve has shifted inward because of this increase in income for the inferior good. And if we want to show what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity, we just go to that new equilibrium point. That is where D1, the new demand curve, intersects the original supply curve. And we make sure we label that as Q1. And then we can do the same thing for the equilibrium price. We go to the equilibrium where the demand curve D1 and S intersect one another, and that gives us the new equilibrium price, which is P1. And once again, if you so desire, if you want to put in arrows to show which direction the price was moving, we see that that causes the equilibrium price to decrease, and we see that the equilibrium quantity also decreases. So with the increase in income, and it's an inferior good, the demand curve shifts inward, and the net result of this is that the equilibrium price falls from P0 to P1, and the equilibrium quantity falls from Q0 to Q1. Let's do another example, except now we're going to be talking about a decrease in income for an inferior good. So once again, let me resize this so it's easier for everybody to see. So there's a decrease in income for an inferior good. Once again, income is a determinant of demand, so we know the demand curve is going to shift. We also know that the relationship between demand and income for an inferior good is an inverse relationship. So if income is decreasing, demand is actually increasing. So we will see that the demand curve will shift to the right because of the decrease in income, and we're analyzing the impact on an inferior good. So there is our new demand curve. We make sure we label that as D1. we take our original demand curve and label it as D0 to make sure we distinguish between our original demand curve and our new demand curve. And once again, as I said previously, if you like, you can draw in arrows to give an indication as to which way the demand curve shifted. So we add those arrows in because that shows that the demand curve is increasing. It's shifting to the right. And we can show what the new equilibrium price and quantity is. So if we go from where D1 intersects the original supply curve and go straight down, that gives us the new equilibrium quantity. So that is Q1. So what happened to quantity? Quantity increased with the increase in demand. All right. And what happens to the equilibrium price? If we go to that new equilibrium point where D1 intersects the original supply curve and goes straight across, that gives us our new equilibrium price. So we will label that as P1 so we can distinguish it between the original demand curve and the new demand curve. So that's P1, and we can draw in an arrow to clearly illustrate the fact that this caused the equilibrium price to increase. So those first 4 slides that I went through, I just went through all the different variations that can occur with income. And remember, with income, you have to make sure that you know what happens when it is an inferior good versus a normal good. So make sure you don't get those two confused because demand curves shift in opposite directions in those different instances. Let's go over another example here. And again, let me resize this so it's easier for everyone to see. Here, I'm talking about the market for good B. So this is the supply and demand curve for B. And what's occurring, that we see an increase in the price of good A. And we are noting that good A and good B are substitutes for one another. So there is a relationship between good A and good B. So here we have the supply and demand curves for good B, and the change in the market is an increase in the price of good A. And we are noting that good A and good B are substitutes for one another. That means they can be used in place of one another. So our expectation is that if we increase the price of good A, and good A and B are substitutes, people will substitute away from good A, and they will buy more of good B. Why? Because as good A goes up in price, it will be more expensive relative to good B, and people will substitute away from good A to good B. So once again, we know that there's an increase in price of a good and the price of substitutes. That's going to impact the demand curve. All right, so we know that the demand for good B is going to increase because of the increase in price of good A. So the demand curve is going to shift to the right. And again, make sure you label these so I can understand that you are shifting the demand curve in the right direction. Make sure you label the original demand curve and the new demand curve so it's explicit that there's a difference between those two demand curves. And once again, as I told you previously, if you want, it makes it easier for me to grade if I take a look and you have arrows showing which way the demand curve shifted. It makes it much easier for me to determine whether or not you understand the concept and you are getting this question right. So we are showing the demand curve shifting to the right, and what is going to be the impact on equilibrium price and quantity. If we go to the new equilibrium, and that is where D1 intersects the original supply curve and goes straight down, that gives us the new equilibrium quantity. So that is Q1. And if you draw in, if you wish, you could draw in an arrow, again showing what happens to the new equilibrium quantity. The new equilibrium quantity increases from Q0 to Q1. We can do the same thing for equilibrium price. We go where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. We go straight across, and that gives us the new equilibrium price. And if you draw an arrow in explicitly showing this, it shows that what? That when there's an increase in the price of good A, if we're talking about the market for good B, and there's an increase in the price of good A, and good A and B are substitutes for one another, what will occur is people will substitute away from good A because it's relatively more expensive, and the demand for good B will increase. When the demand for good B increases, this will increase the price of good B and will also cause the equilibrium quantity in the market for good B to also increase. Again, we have another example here, but in this example, again, we're sticking with good B. So this is a supply and demand for good B, and what we're taking a look at is now that there is a decrease in the price of good A, and good A and good B are still substitutes. So here are the supply and demand curves in the equilibrium price and quantity for good B, and the change in the market is that the price of good A has decreased. Since A and B are substitutes for one another, good A is cheaper, is less expensive relative to good B. We would expect people to substitute away from good B and buy more of good A. Therefore, the demand curve for good B will shift to the left. So the way we show this is by drawing in a new demand curve. So here is our new demand curve. We make sure we label this as D1, and we label the original demand curve as D0. All right, so that is what's going to happen. We can show the shift by drawing in arrows here. And let me change that to a dotted line. So the demand curve is shifting inward. So because of the decrease in the price of good A, the demand for good B will shift to the left. That's represented by the fact that we started off at D0 and now we are at D1. So how do we illustrate what the equilibrium price and quantity? Once again, we go to the new equilibrium. The new equilibrium is where D1 intersects the original supply curve. So if we go from that point straight down, that gives us the equilibrium quantity. So that equilibrium quantity is Q1. Again, we can draw in an arrow to illustrate the fact that we see that the equilibrium quantity has decreased. So originally the equilibrium quantity was Q0 and the new equilibrium quantity is Q1. How do we determine what the equilibrium price is? We go to the same equilibrium point where D1 intersects S and we go straight across to the price axis. And that gives us the new equilibrium price, and we will call this P1. And again, if you like, you could put an arrow in and you're explicitly showing to me what happens to the price. So in this instance here, if we're talking about good B, and we end up seeing a decrease in the price of good A, and we know that good A and B are substitutes, people will substitute away from good B, purchase more of good A. That means the demand curve for good B will shift to the left. So original demand curve was D1, the original demand curve is D0, the new demand curve is D1. The demand curve has shifted to the left. The new equilibrium has a price of P1 and Q1, and in this instance, the equilibrium price fell and the equilibrium quantity also fell. Go on to another example. Here we are talking about two goods that are, it has complementary goods. This should be substitute goods, correct? It says substitute goods. I believe that these two should say complementary goods. My apologies. Let me make that editorial change here. So these goods are complementary, meaning they are used together. All right. So we're talking about the market for good B. So that's the supply and demand for good B. And we see an increase in the price of good A, but good A and good B are complementary. They have a tendency to be used together. They are complements to one another. All right. So if good A and good B are complements and the price of A is going up, it's also going to increase the cost of using good B. So when there's an increase in the price of a good and both of those two goods are complementary, so if we have an increase in the price of good A and good A and B are complementary, the demand for good B will decrease. So if we draw in that new demand curve, make sure we label it appropriately. So this is D1. Make sure we label this as D0. So we have our original demand curve D0 and our new demand curve D1. That's a shift in the demand for good B because of the fact that the price of good A went up. The reason for this is that good A and B are complements. They have a tendency to be used together. And once again, if you like, you can draw in arrows to indicate which way the demand curve is shifting. So you're explicit. I'm giving you these examples because generally if I have an answer key, this is how the answer key shows up. And I'm just giving you these points because if you answer the question in this fashion, it's very easy for me to determine whether or not you got the question right and what you understood about this. So now that we have the demand curve shifting inward, we need to determine what the new equilibrium price and quantity are. So if we go straight down from the new equilibrium point where D1 intersects the original supply curve and we go straight down, that gives us the new equilibrium quantity, which we will label as Q1. And to illustrate that the equilibrium quantity fell, you can just draw a little arrow in to show that there's a decrease in the quantity, the equilibrium quantity from Q0 to Q1. If we want to illustrate the equilibrium price, we go from that same equilibrium point to the left. That gives us the new equilibrium price, and as we can see here, the equilibrium price fell from P0 to P1, and then we draw in an arrow to indicate that. Let's move on to the next example. And once again, let me make that editorial change that these are complementary goods. That means, again, that they are being used together. They have a tendency to be used together. So we have a decrease in the price of good A, and we're talking about the market for good B. If there's a decrease in good A, and good A and B are complementary, this will increase the demand for good B. Since they are used together and the complementary good is cheaper, people are going to have a higher tendency to consume good A, which means they're going to have a higher tendency to consume good B. So this will cause the demand curve to shift to the right. So let's make sure that we label this correctly. This is our new demand curve, D1. Let's take the original demand curve, D0. So we can show that. So we have our original demand curve and our new demand curve. We could draw arrows in to indicate which way the demand curve shifted. So it's obvious that you're showing that the demand curve is shifting in the right direction. Now from this, if we want to determine what is going to be the new equilibrium price and quantity, once again we go to the new equilibrium point. That's where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. If we go to that point and straight down, that gives us the new equilibrium quantity. So that is Q1. And if we want, draw a little arrow in to indicate that the equilibrium quantity increased because of this change in the marketplace. So the equilibrium quantity increased from Q0 to Q1. If we want to know what happened to the price, we can go in and draw the price line, which is at the new equilibrium point where D1 and the original supply curve intersect one another, and that gives us the new equilibrium price. So we label that as P1. And once again, what we can do is draw in a little arrow to show that the equilibrium price increased because of this.